I want to bring in now former CIA Director John Brennan and MSNBC Senior National Security and Intelligence Analyst. Director Brennan, good morning. It's great to see you on set.
Good morning, Holly. Hi, Emma.
Hey, good to see you.
This is the first we've heard from you since these developments started happening this morning. The 93 minutes that President Biden and President Putin had in that smaller group meeting. We are now in just about 2 minutes entering what we think is hour 2 of the larger group meeting. We've talked about who's in the room. I wonder what your assessment is right now of what you've seen so far.
Well, I think it's going according to schedule as far as the timing is concerned.
That's all we really know, right, is the hours and the minutes of the time.
Yes, and I do think it's important that President Biden have the opportunity to sit down with Vladimir Putin and look him in the eye and talk to him about what his expectations are and what some of the red lines are. So I think that first 90 minutes, he wanted to have it as a very small group so he could lay down some very clear signals to Vladimir Putin. Now it's being expanded to have the other experts in the room so they can talk about some of these issues in depth. But I do think it's important for President Biden to let Vladimir Putin know that in response to some of these very provocative actions that Russia has engaged in over the past several years, that President Biden is willing to risk escalation. And I think that's one of the things that has been absent to date. When you look at Ukraine, Crimea, Syria, cyber, I think the United States, understandably, has been very reluctant to go down an escalatory path. Right. Now, Joe Biden doesn't want things to escalate. But if Vladimir Putin believes that he can continue to push the United States and not get the United States to respond in a very forceful manner, then he's going to continue to push the envelope. And so I think Joe Biden wants to convince Vladimir Putin that he is willing to escalate and he is not going to just turn another cheek when Russia engages in these actions.
Putin has to believe him when he says that.
Well, that's right. Yes. And Joe Biden is somebody who I worked with extensively over the years. And I heard him say so many times, big nations can't bluff. Because if you bluff and you don't follow through on your words, then that's a real problem, that you undermine your own credibility. And so I think Joe Biden is going to be very careful in terms of what he says, but he's going to make it very clear that what he says is what he means. And that includes in the cyber front.
So much of our ability to convey that message depends on what happens to us domestically. And you have been outspoken critic of what certainly has played out here in our domestic politics. Does that message get diluted that we're not prepared to escalate given our domestic political instability and what we saw happen on January the 6th and coming out of 4 years of President Trump, where some people said there was a sympathetic message in some circles of American politics to Russia?
Well, yes, that was because of the former administration and Donald Trump. But I do think if there's an issue that transcends that partisan divide in Congress, especially, it's Russian aggression. I do think the Republicans and the Democrats are united in trying to make sure that Russia does not take advantage of the freedoms and liberties that exist in this country and continue to carry out these cyber assaults and attacks. And so I do think that there is a consensus about pushing back against Biden. And nobody wants to trip a wire that's going to lead to an escalatory cycle. Right. But at the same time, you have to be strong.
You talk about the comparison, and Eamon brought this up, right, between the prior administration and this one. And as we all know, you've been outspoken on that point. There's a couple of comparison points. Number one, the timing of that more intimate meeting, let's say. We know it was an hour, 33 minutes. This instance, it was something like 2 hours and 10 minutes when it was just former President Trump and Vladimir Putin in the room, right, a longer session. There's also sort of how the both bilaterals started in 2018 in Helsinki when you and I were there versus now. Watch.
Still, the U.S. and Russian relations have a lot of issues accumulated that require the highest level meeting. And I hope that our meeting will be productive.
Well, thank you. As I said outside, I think it's always better to meet face to face.
Well, first of all, Mr. President, I'd like to congratulate you on a really great World Cup, one of the best ever.
I mean, the tone is obviously starkly different. What do you read into the differences here, and how should people understand that?
Well, first of all, Joe Biden is somebody who has been engaged on the foreign scene, foreign policy, international affairs for about half a century. So unlike a Donald Trump, who really was a novice and an amateur, and stumbled through these issues.
By the way, ran on being an amateur, right?
Yes,
touted the fact.
But when Vladimir Putin would look at Donald Trump, he knew that Donald Trump didn't understand these issues at all. But Joe Biden, who has seen the evolution of them over the years, he realized Vladimir Putin realizes that Joe Biden is deeply knowledgeable about these issues and can talk substantively in a way that Donald Trump never could.
I believe Andrea Mitchell has a question for you, Director.
Hi, Director Brennan. Well, there's among the contrasts to the last summit, there's certainly going to be no one-on-one without an American note-taker or translator, as there was. Now, from your understanding, was there ever any knowledge among U.S. officials, unless they had some sort of secret Kremlin source? I'm not going to ask you about that. How would we ever know what the two men talked about in that one-on-one meeting with just a Kremlin translator?
Well, that's the question I think that many of us have, is what was actually discussed between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin in that Helsinki very private meeting. I don't know if it's known in the U.S. government intelligence community or other places what was actually discussed. But I do think that the Vladimir Putin-Donald Trump relationship was a very, very curious and concerning one that I think troubled many of us, and I think continues to, as Vladimir Putin continues to speak so highly of Donald Trump. And this is something that I think Joe Biden wants to make sure that he has Tony Blinken with him, that the two of them can be there and talking with Putin and Lazarev. And so, therefore, I don't know what was discussed, but I do have my deep concerns that what was discussed between those two in Helsinki in a very private setting.
We are getting some new information in that I want to share with you, Director Brennan, and the rest of our viewers here as well, regarding the timing of this. So we know, as we've been talking about, that the expanded part of this meeting is happening now. But there is a timing distinction here. So when we first reported this, what was it, Amy, about 45 minutes ago, the note from the guidance from a White House official was that the smaller meeting was ending and the bigger meeting was beginning. That was about like a quarter after 9 o'clock Eastern time. We are now learning that expanded meeting did not start until the top of this hour. So 10 o'clock Eastern time, obviously different Geneva time. So that's been going on for about 20 minutes. That means there was this interim time period, right, between the shorter meeting and the smaller meeting and the larger meeting, about almost 45 minutes, right? So I say all this to say, when we don't know what they're talking about, we at least know when they are talking. And so we want to be clear with you about the timing of this. And we'll lay this all out in a timeline here in a graphic in just a second. But Director Brennan, what would have happened in those interim 45 minutes? I might imagine, just in my coverage of Washington here, there would have been a debrief, I presume, from the president to his team before they began that bigger meeting. Perhaps, by the way, a break. The White House had said that there will be time for leaders, both leaders, to take breaks. They're not going to eat together. They're not having like a lunch together, but at least to go, whatever do they need to do. Give us some insight into how this might have unfolded.
I think it's all the above. They wanted a break in between those two meetings, but also I think it's very important for President Biden and Secretary Blinken to talk with the team about what was the tone, what was the atmosphere in that meeting, that small meeting, what type of adjustments they might need to make in terms of the follow-on discussions that they had planned. What are the points that they should emphasize? What do they need to take note of? And so it's not just a question of debriefing what happened, but also thinking about whether or not they need to make any adjustments in their planned engagement during that larger meeting. And so I think that's very important to have that type of discussion, as opposed to Jake Sullivan and others going into that larger meeting not knowing what's going on. And I'm sure Putin did the same thing, probably to a less, significant degree with his people. But I do think that's something that President Biden really likes to engage with his close advisors, wants to make sure they're all on the same sheet of music as they went into that larger meeting. Yeah, so the clock ticking out about 23 minutes into that second part of the meeting. Andrea.
And Director Brennan, when I first started covering these summits between Reagan and Gorbachev, it was all about arms control. That was the main threat against the United States, the arsenal from the Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union. Now it's about cyber. What is the increased threat and the increased difficulty in verification when you're talking about cyber in the context of arms control? Well,
I think the message that President Biden wants to send is that Russia needs to be accountable for its actions. Those that are directed by President Putin and that are engaged in by the intelligence security services, but also those that come from the organized Russian criminal gangs inside of Russia, those enterprises that are engaged in these types of cyber attacks against the U.S. private sector and also against the government. And he wants to make sure that it is known. Now, whether or not there's going to be some type of progress toward having some discussions bilaterally and multilaterally about what can be done to try to control control this great proliferation of cyber activity and cyber attacks, I think is still to be learned. But I do think that what President Biden wants to do is to make sure that Putin understands that this continued expansion of these cyber attacks against our critical infrastructure, they are tripping wires that are going to require President Biden to respond in a very, I think, forceful manner. We do have capabilities in the cyber front that we have not used. Now, I think President Biden has to decide what type of offensive actions he might want to take in response to these Russian provocations.
Director Brennan, the terms that we heard going into this meeting were predictability and stability, and that is something that this administration is seeking. From a Russian perspective, from Vladimir Putin's perspective, the argument that he made to our colleague here, Simmons, it is the U.S. that is destabilizing parts of the Middle East, invasions in Iraq, Libya, Syria. When he brings those up in a meeting, as we assume he would, what does the U.S. say to the issue of stability and predictability in places like the Middle East and their role in it?
Well, I think President Biden will be very candid in terms of acknowledging that the Middle East and South Asia are very, very difficult regions of the world, that over the course of several administrations, there have been a number of attempts to bring that stability and also to bring some predictability. But the dynamics of the Middle East and places like Afghanistan have their own sort of course of developments. And so, therefore, I think I don't think he's going to engage in a debate with Vladimir Putin about what the U.S. did or didn't do. That would be not productive. And Putin is going to, keep to his talking points and continue to point the finger at the United States. But what President Biden is going to do is to make sure that Putin understands that Biden is in charge now. He's in control. He's going to move forward. And over the course of his administration, whether it be 4 years or 8 years, there is going to be a continuity of effort. And there is going to be, I like to think, this predictability as far as how the United States is going to respond to some of these crises. And Russia needs to take note of it. It's a different day than it was during the Trump administration, which is why Biden wanted to actually look in Putin's eyes and tell him that.
And that's what he's doing as we speak. Former CIA Director John Brennan. Director Brennan, thank you for being with us.